Good evening, dear friend. Come now, settle yourself gently into comfort and let the concerns of the day drift away like clouds moving slowly across an evening sky. Tonight, I want to tell you a story about ideas, about how thoughts written in books and spoken in quiet rooms can slowly reshape the world, about how philosophers and writers in 18th century France began to question the very foundations of their society. This is not a story of sudden revolution or dramatic upheaval, but rather of gradual transformation, of ideas spreading quietly through conversations and correspondence, changing how people thought about power, freedom, and the organization of human society. As you rest here in the peaceful darkness, breathing slowly and steadily, let yourself drift back through time with me, back to France in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, when the kingdom stood at the height of its power under a system of absolute monarchy that had endured for generations. The France you enter is dominated by the figure of King Louis XIV, who reigned from 1643 until 1715, a span of 72 years that made him one of the longest reigning monarchs in European history. Louis XIV embodied the principle of absolute monarchy more completely than perhaps any other European ruler, and he expressed this principle in his famous statement, "L'état, c'est moi, I am the state." These words were not merely a boast but a declaration of political philosophy, an assertion that the king was not simply the head of government but was himself the living embodiment of the state, that his will was law, that his decisions were final, that he answered to no earthly authority. The Palace of Versailles, which Louis XIV built on a grand scale unmatched anywhere in Europe, served as both his residence and the physical manifestation of absolute power. As you breathe slowly and let yourself relax more deeply, imagine this vast palace complex with its hundreds of rooms, its hall of mirrors stretching the length of a football field, its elaborate gardens designed with geometric precision, its countless sculptures and fountains celebrating the glory of the king. Versailles was not merely a home but a political statement, a demonstration of power and wealth designed to overwhelm visitors with the grandeur of the monarchy and to remind everyone who entered that they stood in the presence of absolute authority. The theory that justified absolute monarchy was the doctrine of divine right, the belief that kings ruled by the authority of God, that their power came not from the people they governed but from heaven itself. According to this theory, God had established monarchy as the proper form of government, had chosen particular dynasties to rule, and had granted kings the authority to govern their subjects as they saw fit. To question the king's authority was not merely political dissent but blasphemy, a challenge to the divine order of the universe. This theory was taught in churches, preached from pulpits, and incorporated into official ceremonies and rituals that reinforced the sacred nature of royal power. The French monarchy under Louis XIV had carefully constructed a system of government that concentrated power in the king's hands. Louis governed through royal councils and ministers who served at his pleasure and who carried out his decisions. He did not convene the Estates General, the representative assembly that had occasionally met in earlier periods to advise the king and to approve taxes. The nobility, who in earlier times had possessed significant independent power, were brought to Versailles where they served the king in elaborate court rituals that kept them occupied and dependent on royal favor. The provinces of France were administered by royal intendants, officials appointed by the king who answered directly to him rather than to local authorities. This system of absolute monarchy was not unique to France but was part of a broader pattern in European political development during the 17th century. Across Europe, monarchs were consolidating power, reducing the independence of nobility and representative institutions, creating centralized bureaucracies that extended royal authority into previously autonomous regions. The reasons for this consolidation were complex, involving military competition between states, the need to finance expensive armies and wars, and the development of more sophisticated administrative techniques that made centralized control more feasible than it had been in earlier periods. As you rest quietly, breathing slowly and peacefully, imagine what it meant to live under absolute monarchy as an ordinary French subject in the late 17th century. Your life was governed by decisions made in Versailles by a king you would never see, decisions about taxation, about military conscription, about law and order, about religion and culture. You had no vote, no representation, no formal way to influence these decisions or to hold the king accountable for policies that affected your life. The social structure was rigid, divided into three estates: the clergy, who were the first estate, the nobility, who were the second estate, and everyone else, from wealthy merchants to poor peasants, who comprised the third estate. Your birth determined your estate, and your estate largely determined your opportunities and obligations. The Catholic Church was intimately connected with the monarchy, providing religious sanction for royal authority and benefiting from royal protection and support. The Church owned vast lands, collected its own taxes called tithes, and exercised significant influence over education and culture. The king, in turn, influenced church appointments and policy, and the alliance between throne and altar reinforced the power of both institutions. To question religious orthodoxy could be dangerous, as the fate of French Protestants demonstrated when Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes in 1685, ending the limited toleration that Protestants had enjoyed and forcing many to convert or flee the country. This world of absolute monarchy and religious uniformity, of rigid social hierarchy and concentrated power, was the world into which the Enlightenment would gradually introduce new and challenging ideas. The transition from Louis XIV's reign to that of his successors, Louis XV and later Louis XVI, would see the slow development of an intellectual movement that questioned the fundamental assumptions on which absolute monarchy rested. These questions would not emerge suddenly or dramatically but would develop gradually over decades, spreading through books and pamphlets, through conversations in salons and coffee houses, through correspondence networks that linked intellectuals across France and across Europe. The death of Louis XIV in 1715 marked the end of an era, but the system he had perfected continued. His great-grandson Louis XV inherited a kingdom that was wealthy and powerful, that dominated European politics and culture, that seemed stable and secure. But beneath this apparent stability, changes were beginning to occur. The economy was evolving, with commerce and manufacturing growing in importance alongside traditional agriculture. Urban centers were expanding, creating new social spaces and new forms of association. Literacy was gradually spreading beyond the elite, creating larger audiences for printed materials. And a generation of intellectuals was beginning to ask questions that had not been asked so openly before, questions about the sources of political authority, about the rights of individuals, about the proper organization of society. The Enlightenment in France did not begin with a manifesto or a movement, but rather emerged gradually as individual thinkers, often working independently, began to apply reason and critical thought to questions of politics, society, and human nature. These thinkers drew on various intellectual traditions, including the scientific revolution of the 17th century, which had demonstrated the power of rational inquiry to unlock nature's secrets, and the political philosophy of English and Dutch thinkers who had developed theories of limited government and individual rights. But French Enlightenment thinkers would develop their own distinctive approaches and emphases, shaped by the particular conditions of French society and by their own experiences and concerns. As you breathe slowly and sink deeper into peaceful rest, you can sense how this intellectual transformation was beginning, how the seeds of new ideas were being planted in a soil that had been prepared by social and economic changes, how a world that seemed permanent and unchangeable was beginning to be questioned by those who dared to think differently about power, authority, and human possibility. As the 18th century progressed and France entered the period known as the Regency and then the long reign of Louis XV, a new spirit of intellectual inquiry began to emerge among educated French men and women, a spirit that questioned traditional authorities and that sought to understand the world through reason rather than through unexamined acceptance of inherited beliefs. As you rest comfortably and breathe slowly, let me tell you about the early voices of the French Enlightenment and about the intellectual climate in which they worked. The term Enlightenment itself, called the Siècle des Lumières or Century of Light in French, captured the movement's central metaphor, that reason and knowledge were like light illuminating the darkness of ignorance and superstition, that the application of rational thought could lead humanity out of error and toward truth and progress. This was an optimistic vision, one that believed in human capacity for improvement, that rejected fatalism and blind obedience to tradition, that insisted that societies could be reformed and perfected through the application of reason. One of the earliest and most influential figures in the French Enlightenment was Charles Louis II, Baron de Montesquieu, a nobleman, judge, and man of letters who lived from 1689 to 1755. Montesquieu came from the legal nobility of southwestern France, and he inherited a position as president of the Parliament of Bordeaux, one of the regional courts that had some limited ability to review and register royal edicts. His experience in this position gave him direct knowledge of how government actually functioned and of the tensions between royal authority and traditional legal procedures. Montesquieu's most important work, The Spirit of the Laws, published in 1748, was a massive study of political systems and legal institutions that examined how different governments operated and what factors influenced their character and stability. The book was not a systematic treatise or a utopian blueprint, but rather a wide-ranging comparative analysis that drew on examples from classical antiquity, from contemporary Europe, from travelers' accounts of other civilizations, and from Montesquieu's own observations and reflections. As you breathe slowly and let yourself relax more deeply, imagine Montesquieu working on this enormous project over many years, reading widely, taking notes, organizing his thoughts into a structure that moved from general principles to specific observations, always seeking to understand not just how governments operated, but why they operated as they did, what underlying causes produced particular effects. His approach was analytical rather than prescriptive, observing rather than denouncing, though his observations contained implicit criticisms of absolute monarchy and suggestions for how political systems might be improved. One of Montesquieu's most influential ideas was his theory of the separation of powers, the argument that governmental power should be divided among different institutions rather than concentrated in a single authority. He identified three types of power: legislative power to make laws, executive power to enforce laws, and judicial power to interpret laws and to adjudicate disputes. Montesquieu argued that for liberty to be protected, these three powers should be separated and placed in different hands, with each power serving as a check on the others. This theory challenged the fundamental principle of absolute monarchy, which concentrated all three types of power in the king. In an absolute monarchy, the king made laws through royal edicts, enforced them through appointed officials, and could intervene in judicial proceedings when he chose. Montesquieu's separation of powers implied that this concentration of authority was dangerous, that it made tyranny possible, that true political liberty required divided and balanced power rather than unified and absolute power. Montesquieu developed this theory partly from his study of the English political system, which he somewhat idealized, but which did feature a degree of separation between Parliament, which legislated, the Crown, which executed, and the courts, which judged. He argued that England's system, for all its imperfections, protected liberty better than France's absolute monarchy precisely because power was divided rather than concentrated. This argument would prove enormously influential, not only in France but throughout Europe and eventually in America, where the founders of the United States would incorporate separation of powers into their constitution. Another early Enlightenment figure whose work challenged traditional authorities was François-Marie Arouet, who wrote under the pen name Voltaire and who would become perhaps the most famous intellectual of the 18th century. Voltaire, who lived from 1694 to 1778, was a writer of extraordinary versatility and productivity, producing plays, poems, histories, philosophical works, and an enormous correspondence that linked him to intellectuals throughout Europe. His writing style was characterized by wit, clarity, and a talent for satire that he used to devastating effect against targets including religious intolerance, legal barbarism, and political tyranny. Voltaire's early life included conflicts with authority that shaped his later views. He was briefly imprisoned in the Bastille for writings considered disrespectful to the regent, and he later spent several years in exile in England, where, like Montesquieu, he was impressed by what he saw as greater political and religious liberty than existed in France. These experiences convinced Voltaire that France's political and religious institutions needed reform, that the arbitrary power of the monarchy and the intolerance of the Catholic Church were obstacles to human happiness and progress. As you rest quietly in the peaceful darkness, breathing slowly and deeply, imagine Voltaire in his study, writing prolifically, dictating to secretaries, carrying on correspondence with kings and philosophers and educated men and women across Europe, using his pen as a weapon in countless battles against what he saw as ignorance, prejudice, and injustice. His famous motto, "Écrasez l'infâme," crush the infamous thing, referred primarily to religious intolerance and superstition, but it captured his general attitude of militant opposition to institutions and beliefs that he considered obstacles to human reason and happiness. Voltaire's political views were complex and somewhat contradictory. He was not a democrat or a believer in popular sovereignty. Indeed, he was skeptical of the masses and believed that enlightened reform should come from above, from educated and rational rulers who would govern wisely rather than according to traditional or religious principles. He admired what he called enlightened despotism, ruled by a powerful monarch who would use his authority to reform society according to rational principles, to eliminate legal barbarities, to promote religious toleration, to encourage education and commerce. This vision of enlightened despotism was different from absolute monarchy as practiced by Louis XIV, because it imagined royal power being used to promote reason and progress rather than to maintain traditional privilege and religious orthodoxy. Despite his acceptance of monarchical power, Voltaire's actual influence was to undermine respect for traditional authority by subjecting it to relentless criticism and ridicule. His satirical novel Candide, published in 1759, mocked philosophical optimism but also contained implicit criticisms of war, slavery, religious persecution, and various other evils that flourished under the political and social systems of his time. His Philosophical Dictionary, a compendium of short essays on various topics, challenged religious dogmas and traditional beliefs with a combination of reason, wit, and devastating irony. Voltaire became particularly influential through his interventions in specific legal cases where he believed injustice had been done. He championed the Collars case, where a Protestant merchant was tortured and executed on false charges of killing his son to prevent the son's conversion to Catholicism, and he worked tirelessly to clear Collars's name and to expose the religious prejudice and legal barbarism that had led to this miscarriage of justice. Through cases like this, Voltaire demonstrated the practical importance of Enlightenment principles, showing that religious intolerance and arbitrary legal procedures had real and terrible consequences for real people. The early Enlightenment voices represented by Montesquieu and Voltaire were not calling for revolution or for the overthrow of the monarchy. They were reformers rather than revolutionaries, believing that existing institutions could and should be improved through the application of reason. But their work began to create a climate of opinion in which traditional authorities could be questioned, in which the divine right of kings and the absolute authority of the Church were no longer simply accepted but were subjected to critical examination. This questioning, this insistence that institutions should be judged by rational standards rather than by tradition or revelation, would gradually erode the intellectual foundations of absolute monarchy even as the institution itself remained powerful and apparently secure. Among the philosophers of the French Enlightenment, one figure stands out for the radical nature of his political thought and for the profound influence his ideas would have on revolutionary movements: Jean-Jacques Rousseau. As you breathe slowly and rest comfortably, let me tell you about Rousseau and about his challenging vision of human freedom and political legitimacy. Rousseau, who lived from 1712 to 1778, was in many ways an outsider to the educated elite of Paris who dominated French intellectual life. He was born in Geneva, Switzerland, to a watchmaker's family, and his early life was marked by poverty, wandering, and a lack of formal education. He came to Paris as an adult and gradually made a name for himself through his writings, but he always maintained a certain distance from the sophisticated salon culture and always felt himself to be different from the well-born intellectuals who were his contemporaries. Rousseau's political philosophy, developed most fully in his work The Social Contract, published in 1762, began with premises that were radically different from those that supported absolute monarchy. Where the theory of divine right located political authority in God's will and in the sacred person of the king, Rousseau argued that legitimate political authority could only come from the people themselves, from a social contract freely entered into by citizens who agreed to form a political community and to be governed by laws they themselves had made or consented to. The opening line of The Social Contract announced Rousseau's central concern: man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. This statement was not merely a description but an indictment, a declaration that existing political and social arrangements had destroyed the natural freedom that human beings possessed. The task Rousseau set himself was to determine whether there could be a legitimate political order that preserved freedom rather than destroying it, whether people could be governed by laws while remaining free. As you breathe slowly and let yourself relax more deeply, imagine the revolutionary implications of Rousseau's starting point. If people were naturally free, then all political authority required justification. The mere existence of traditional institutions, the claims of ancient dynasties, the pronouncements of religious authorities, none of these could simply be accepted as legitimate. Political legitimacy had to be earned by demonstrating that the political order preserved rather than violated natural freedom. This was a standard that absolute monarchy could not meet. Rousseau's solution to the problem of reconciling political authority with freedom was his theory of the social contract and the general will. He argued that legitimate government was based on a compact in which individuals agreed to form a political community and to submit to the general will of that community. The general will was not simply the sum of individual wills or the preference of a majority, but was rather the genuine common interest of the community, what was truly good for all citizens rather than what particular individuals or factions wanted. According to Rousseau, when citizens obeyed laws that expressed the general will, they were not submitting to an external authority but were obeying themselves, were following the decisions they had collectively made as members of the political community. True freedom, in Rousseau's view, consisted not in doing whatever one pleased but in obeying laws one had participated in making, in living under rules that reflected the common good rather than the will of a master. This was a demanding and somewhat paradoxical definition of freedom, but it allowed Rousseau to argue that legitimate political authority and individual freedom were compatible. The implications of Rousseau's theory for absolute monarchy were devastating. If political legitimacy came from the consent of the governed, then a monarchy that rested on divine right and that concentrated all power in the king was illegitimate by definition. Rousseau did not argue that monarchy was necessarily illegitimate in all forms, but he did argue that any legitimate government, whether monarchical, aristocratic, or democratic, had to be based ultimately on the consent of the citizens and had to serve the common good rather than the private interest of rulers. Rousseau's political thought was more radical than that of most other Enlightenment thinkers. Montesquieu had criticized absolute monarchy but had accepted the basic framework of monarchy reformed and limited by law. Voltaire had advocated for enlightened despotism, for wise rulers who would govern rationally but who would still rule from above. Rousseau, by contrast, implied that legitimate government required genuine popular sovereignty, required that ordinary people participate in making the laws under which they lived, required a degree of political equality that was incompatible with the rigid social hierarchies of 18th century France. Rousseau's ideas about education and society, developed in works like Emile and the Discourse on Inequality, complemented his political philosophy. He argued that human beings were naturally good but had been corrupted by civilization and by social institutions that created inequality and dependence. He believed that proper education could help preserve natural goodness while allowing people to live in society, and he thought that social arrangements should be reformed to reduce inequality and to create conditions in which genuine virtue and freedom were possible. As you rest quietly in the peaceful darkness, breathing slowly and deeply, you can appreciate how Rousseau's thought challenged not just specific features of the French political system but the fundamental assumptions on which that system rested. He questioned the legitimacy of hierarchy, the naturalness of inequality, the authority of tradition and prescription. He insisted that political and social arrangements should be evaluated by rational standards derived from human nature and human needs rather than simply accepted because they were traditional or because they served the interests of the powerful. Rousseau's influence on the French Revolution would be profound, though complex and contested. Revolutionary leaders would invoke his name and his principles, would quote his works, would claim to be implementing his vision of popular sovereignty and the general will. The famous revolutionary slogan "Liberty, Equality, Fraternity" reflected Rousseauian values, and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen incorporated Rousseauian ideas about natural rights and popular sovereignty. But whether Rousseau himself would have approved of the revolutionary government and its actions is a question that admits no simple answer. What is clear is that Rousseau's political philosophy represented a fundamental challenge to absolute monarchy and to the social and political order of 18th century France. His insistence that legitimate government required popular consent, his assertion that people were born free and equal, his demand that political arrangements be justified by rational argument rather than by tradition or revelation, all of these ideas struck at the foundations of the old regime and helped create an intellectual climate in which fundamental political change became thinkable. Among the great intellectual projects of the French Enlightenment, none was more ambitious or more influential than the Encyclopedia, a massive compendium of knowledge that sought to organize and present human understanding on virtually every subject in a systematic and accessible way. As you breathe slowly and rest comfortably, let me tell you about this remarkable project and about how it served the Enlightenment's goal of spreading rational knowledge and challenging traditional authorities. The Encyclopedia, whose full title was Encyclopedia, or Systematic Dictionary of the Sciences, Arts, and Crafts, was conceived and directed by two men, Denis Diderot, a philosopher and man of letters, and Jean Le Rond d'Alembert, a mathematician and scientist. The project began in 1747 and would occupy the next several decades, eventually producing 17 volumes of text articles and 11 volumes of detailed illustrations, along with several supplementary volumes, creating a work of enormous scope and ambition. The Encyclopedia was not simply a reference work but was, in the words of its creators and contributors, designed to spread Enlightenment values and to promote rational thought and criticism of traditional authorities. Diderot explained in his article on Encyclopedia that the work aimed to assemble all existing knowledge to demonstrate the connections and relationships between different fields of learning, and thereby to promote understanding and to change people's way of thinking. This was an explicitly philosophical and political project, not just an effort to compile information. As you sink deeper into peaceful rest, imagine the enormous labor involved in this project. Diderot and D'Alembert recruited more than 100 contributors, including many of the leading intellectuals of the time. Voltaire wrote articles on literature, history, and philosophy. Montesquieu contributed pieces on political topics before his death. Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote on music. Numerous scientists, physicians, craftsmen, and scholars contributed articles on their areas of expertise. The project required coordinating these diverse contributors, editing their submissions, resolving disputes about content and emphasis, and dealing with the practical challenges of finding publishers and printers willing to produce such a large and potentially controversial work. The encyclopedia covered an astonishing range of topics. There were articles on sciences like mathematics, physics, chemistry, and biology. There were entries on technologies and crafts, describing in detail how various goods were manufactured, how machines operated, how artisans practiced their trades. There were philosophical articles examining questions of metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, and political theory. There were historical entries tracing the development of various peoples, institutions, and ideas. The illustrations were particularly remarkable, showing the tools and techniques of hundreds of different crafts and industries with a precision that made the knowledge accessible to anyone who studied them. But the encyclopedia was not neutral or objective in the modern sense. Articles on religious topics often contain subtle or not so subtle criticisms of Catholic theology and practice. Cross-references directed readers from orthodox positions to heterodox challenges. The article on natural right, for instance, presented political authority as based on human nature and reason rather than on divine command, implicitly challenging the theory of divine right. The sheer inclusiveness of the work, treating craft knowledge alongside theology, practical technology alongside abstract philosophy, suggested that all human knowledge was worthy of study and that traditional authorities did not have a monopoly on truth. As you breathe slowly and peacefully, you can appreciate how the encyclopedia embodied several key Enlightenment values. First, it promoted the accessibility of knowledge, presenting complex ideas and technical information in French rather than in Latin, making learning available to anyone who could read rather than restricting it to those with classical education. Second, it demonstrated faith in reason and empirical observation as sources of knowledge, showing how careful attention to nature and society could reveal truths that tradition and authority might obscure. Third, it implicitly challenged social hierarchies by treating the knowledge of craftsmen and artisans as worthy of the same detailed attention as the learning of scholars and theologians. The encyclopedia faced opposition from religious and political authorities who recognized its challenge to traditional beliefs and institutions. The Papal Index of Forbidden Books condemned it. The French government twice suspended its publication, in 1752 and 1759, responding to pressure from the Catholic Church and from conservatives who saw the work as dangerous to religion and public morals. But the project had powerful supporters, including some highly placed officials who valued learning and who were curious about new ideas. Through persistence, diplomatic maneuvering, and some degree of censorship and self-censorship, Diderot managed to complete the encyclopedia despite these obstacles. The influence of the encyclopedia extended far beyond its immediate readership. Although the full set was expensive and was purchased primarily by wealthy individuals and institutions, the ideas it contained spread through society in various ways. Individual volumes circulated among smaller groups who shared the cost. Articles were discussed in salons and reading clubs. The encyclopedia's approach and its arguments were absorbed and transmitted by the growing class of educated readers, teachers, journalists, and minor officials who mediated between high intellectual culture and broader publics. The encyclopedia represented the Enlightenment's faith in human progress through the spread of knowledge. Diderot and his collaborators believed that ignorance was the enemy of human happiness and freedom, that superstition and prejudice could be overcome through education and rational thought, that society could be improved by making knowledge accessible to all who could benefit from it. This was an optimistic vision, one that perhaps underestimated the obstacles to progress and the ways that power could resist enlightenment, but it was also a vision that inspired intellectual effort and that contributed to a slow transformation in how educated people thought about knowledge, authority, and social organization. The spread of Enlightenment ideas through 18th-century French society occurred not just through published works like books and encyclopedias, but also through face-to-face conversation in social gatherings that brought intellectuals together with aristocrats, wealthy bourgeois, and educated women who served as hostesses and participants in serious intellectual discussion. As you rest comfortably and breathe slowly, let me tell you about the salons of Paris and how they functioned as incubators and disseminators of Enlightenment thought. A salon was a gathering held regularly in the home of a host or hostess, usually an aristocratic or wealthy woman, where intellectuals, writers, artists, and people of social standing would come together for conversation, discussion, and mutual entertainment. The salon was not a formal institution with rules and membership requirements, but rather an informal social gathering, though one that was carefully managed by its hostess, who invited guests, guided conversation, introduced newcomers, and generally created an atmosphere conducive to intelligent and lively discussion. The great salons of 18th-century Paris were associated with particular women whose names became synonymous with intellectual and social sophistication. Madame Geoffrin, who presided over one of the most famous salons for several decades, welcomed philosophers and artists to her home twice weekly, creating an environment where serious discussion mixed with elegant hospitality. Madame du Deffand, despite being blind in her later years, maintained a salon that attracted leading intellectuals including Montesquieu and D'Alembert. Julie de Lespinasse, who had originally been Madame du Deffand's protégée before establishing her own rival salon, created a particularly intense and emotional atmosphere that attracted Rousseau and other sensitive souls. As you breathe slowly and let yourself relax more deeply, imagine the scene at one of these salons on a typical evening. guests arrive in the late afternoon or early evening, dressed in the formal attire appropriate to their social status, entering a drawing room furnished with comfortable chairs arranged in a circle or semicircle to facilitate conversation. The hostess greets each arrival, making introductions when necessary, suggesting topics for discussion, gently steering conversation away from personal gossip or trivial matters toward more substantial subjects. The conversation might range widely over topics including recent publications, scientific discoveries, political developments, philosophical questions, aesthetic judgments about art or theatre. The tone would be sophisticated but accessible, learned but not pedantic, with wit and elegance valued alongside substantive insight. Participants would include established writers and thinkers, younger men trying to make their mark in intellectual circles, aristocrats who fancied themselves cultivated, and occasionally foreigners visiting Paris who brought news and perspectives from other European courts and capitals. The salons served several important functions in the intellectual life of Enlightenment Paris. First, they provided forums for discussing ideas and for refining arguments through conversation. A philosopher working in isolation might develop ideas without subjecting them to critical examination, but in the salon environment those ideas would be questioned, challenged, and tested against the objections and alternative views of intelligent interlocutors. This conversational testing could strengthen good arguments and expose weaknesses in poor ones, contributing to the development of more robust philosophical positions. Second, salons facilitated networking and collaboration among intellectuals. Writers who met at salons might decide to collaborate on projects, might recommend each other for positions or commissions, might support each other's work through positive reviews or through helping to find publishers. The Encyclopedia project, for instance, relied heavily on networks established through salon contacts, with Diderot recruiting contributors from among the philosophers and scholars he met in these social settings. Third, salons created bridges between intellectual culture and social and political power. The aristocrats who attended salons and who sometimes hosted them moved in circles that included ministers, high officials, and even members of the royal family. Ideas discussed in salons could influence policy by reaching the attention of decision-makers, could affect appointments to academic or administrative positions, could help intellectuals gain patrons or secure financial support. This connection between intellectual and social capital gave the salons influence beyond their immediate participants. As you rest quietly in the peaceful darkness, breathing slowly and deeply, you can appreciate the particular role that women played as salon hostesses. In a society where women were largely excluded from formal political power and from most professional and academic positions, the salons offered educated women a way to exercise influence and to participate in intellectual life. A successful salon hostess needed intelligence, tact, social skill, and genuine interest in ideas. She had to be able to guide conversation without dominating it, to draw out shy or reticent participants while restraining those who monopolized discussion, to create an atmosphere that balanced seriousness with pleasure. Some salon hostesses were themselves thinkers and writers. Madame de Staël, whose salon flourished during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic periods, wrote extensively on literature, politics, and society, and her works were taken seriously by male intellectuals who might otherwise have dismissed women's intellectual contributions. But even hostesses who did not write major works themselves contributed to intellectual life by curating discussions, by connecting thinkers with each other, and by providing spaces where ideas could be explored and developed. The salons were not democratic institutions, and they did not directly challenge the social hierarchy of 18th century France. Admission required social connections, cultural capital, the ability to converse in sophisticated French about complex topics, and usually some degree of wealth or noble status. Working-class people, however intelligent, could not simply show up at a salon and expect to be admitted. But within these limitations, the salons did create spaces where merit and intelligence counted for something alongside birth and wealth, where a clever writer from modest background might mix with dukes and ministers on something approaching equal terms. The ideas discussed in salons did not remain confined to these elite circles but spread outward through various mechanisms. Salon participants wrote books and articles that reached broader audiences. Younger men who attended salons as aspiring intellectuals might later teach or enter professions where they transmitted Enlightenment ideas to their students or clients. Servants and others on the margins of salon society overheard discussions and passed along what they learned to different social circles. The salons were nodes in a larger network through which ideas circulated, influencing opinion among educated classes and gradually reshaping how people thought about politics, religion, and society. The spread of Enlightenment ideas through 18th century France occurred in the face of significant obstacles, particularly the system of censorship that the monarchy and the church maintained to control what could be published and read. As you breathe slowly and rest comfortably, let me tell you about the struggle between Enlightenment writers seeking to spread new ideas and the authorities attempting to suppress what they considered dangerous or subversive thought. The French monarchy had long maintained a system of pre-publication censorship under which authors and publishers were required to obtain royal permission, called a privilege, before printing books or pamphlets. The process involved submitting manuscripts to official censors who read them to determine whether they contained anything contrary to religion, to public morals, or to royal authority. Books that passed this examination received the privilege, which not only permitted publication but also gave the author and publisher a monopoly on that work, protecting them from piracy. Books that failed to receive approval could not legally be published or sold in France. This system was designed to prevent the circulation of ideas that challenged established authorities, whether religious or political. Works that directly criticized Catholicism, that questioned the divine right of kings, that advocated political systems incompatible with monarchy, or that discussed sexual matters in ways considered indecent would be refused permission to publish. The penalty for publishing without permission or for selling prohibited books could include fines, imprisonment, or in extreme cases corporeal punishment. Books themselves might be seized and publicly burned, both to destroy the physical copies and to demonstrate official disapproval. But the censorship system, despite its theoretical power, proved increasingly difficult to enforce as the 18th century progressed. The growth of literacy created larger markets for printed materials, making publishing more profitable and encouraging publishers to take risks. The development of printing facilities in neighboring countries where French censorship did not apply meant that books could be printed abroad and smuggled into France, evading official controls. The existence of manuscript circulation networks meant that works could spread in handwritten form even when printed publication was blocked. As you breathe slowly and let yourself relax more deeply, imagine the cat-and-mouse game that developed between writers seeking to evade censorship and authorities trying to enforce it. Authors developed various strategies to get their works into print and into readers' hands. Some published anonymously or under pseudonyms, making it difficult for authorities to identify and punish them. Some submitted carefully edited manuscripts for approval, then published fuller versions abroad that contained the controversial material that had been removed from the approved text. Some used allegorical or satirical forms that disguised their true arguments under layers of literary artifice, allowing sophisticated readers to grasp their meaning while providing plausible deniability if authorities complained. Voltaire, whose writings frequently ran afoul of censors, became a master of these evasive tactics. He published many of his works anonymously or under false names. He maintained connections with publishers in Geneva, Amsterdam, and London who could print his works outside French jurisdiction. When particularly controversial works like Candide appeared, he would publicly deny authorship even as everyone knew the work was his. He sometimes claimed that texts circulating in France were pirated editions that he had not authorized, allowing him to avoid direct responsibility while still benefiting from the work's distribution. The penalties for violating censorship laws could be severe, and some writers and publishers did suffer imprisonment or worse. The Chevalier de la Barre, a young nobleman, was tortured and executed in 1766 for alleged blasphemy and sacrilege, in a case that shocked many people and that Voltaire took up as an example of religious intolerance and judicial barbarism. But such extreme cases were relatively rare, partly because the authorities were often ambivalent about enforcement, recognizing that harsh punishments could create martyrs and could generate sympathy for prohibited works. Many officials charged with enforcing censorship were themselves educated men with some sympathy for Enlightenment ideas. The Directeur de la Librairie, the official responsible for overseeing book publication, often tried to find ways to approve works that technically violated censorship rules, granting tacit permissions that allowed books to be published without formal approval or looking the other way when prohibited books circulated among elite readers. This administrative ambivalence meant that the censorship system, while certainly an obstacle to free expression, was less absolute than it might have been. The struggle against censorship was not just about getting specific books published, but was part of a larger argument about the nature of intellectual freedom and about the relationship between knowledge and authority. Enlightenment thinkers argued that truth could only emerge through free inquiry and open discussion, that attempts to suppress ideas only confirmed that those in power feared rational examination of their claims, that censorship served the interests of those who benefited from ignorance and superstition rather than serving any genuine public good. As you rest quietly in the peaceful darkness, breathing slowly and deeply, you can appreciate how the existence of censorship and the struggle against it shaped Enlightenment thought and its reception. The fact that authorities tried to suppress certain books and ideas gave those works an added allure, making them seem dangerous and exciting, encouraging readers to seek them out precisely because they were forbidden. The need to evade censorship encouraged clarity and sharpness in writing, as authors learned to make their points effectively in forms that could slip past censors or that could reach audiences through underground channels. The battle against censorship also helped create a sense of solidarity among Enlightenment thinkers who saw themselves as engaged in a common struggle against forces of ignorance and oppression. The Republic of Letters, as the international community of intellectuals was sometimes called, functioned partly as a support network for writers facing censorship, with philosophers in one country helping to publish or distribute works by colleagues in countries where those works were banned. This international dimension of Enlightenment intellectual culture helped ideas circulate across borders and helped create a cosmopolitan perspective that transcended narrow nationalism. The eventual triumph of freedom of expression, which would come gradually over the 19th and 20th centuries in France and elsewhere, owed much to the Enlightenment's arguments against censorship and to the practical resistance that Enlightenment writers offered to attempts to control thought and publication. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, adopted during the French Revolution, would proclaim freedom of expression as a fundamental human right, stating that every citizen could speak, write, and publish freely, subject only to accountability for abuses of this freedom. This revolutionary principle had roots in the Enlightenment's long struggle against censorship and in the arguments that philosophers like Voltaire had made about the necessity of intellectual freedom for human progress. Among the targets of Enlightenment criticism, none was more prominent or more controversial than organized religion, particularly the Catholic Church as it existed in 18th century France. As you breathe slowly and rest comfortably, let me tell you about how Enlightenment thinkers challenged religious authority and about the arguments they made for religious tolerance and skepticism. The Catholic Church in 18th century France was not simply a religious institution but was deeply integrated into the political and social structure of the kingdom. The clergy constituted the first estate, possessing extensive land holdings, collecting tithes, controlling most education, and exercising significant influence over culture and morals. The Church worked closely with the monarchy, providing religious legitimation for royal authority through the theory of divine right and supporting the political order in sermons and teachings. Religious uniformity was enforced by law, with Catholicism as the only legally recognized religion and with penalties for those who publicly rejected Catholic teachings. Enlightenment criticism of the Church took several forms. Some philosophes, as the Enlightenment thinkers were called, attacked specific religious doctrines and practices that they considered irrational or superstitious. Others focused on religious intolerance and persecution, arguing that people should be free to follow their own conscience in religious matters. Still others questioned the social and political role of the Church, arguing that religious institutions should not hold such extensive power and wealth. And some went further, questioning the truth of Christianity or of theism itself, advocating for deism, atheism, or agnosticism. Voltaire exemplified the Enlightenment's campaign for religious tolerance and against what he saw as religious fanaticism. His personal religious views were complex, but he generally maintained a deist position, believing in God as creator and moral governor of the universe but rejecting revelation, miracles, and the specific doctrines of Christianity. What truly engaged his passion, however, was opposing religious intolerance and the persecution that flowed from it. His interventions in cases like that of Jean Collars demonstrated the practical consequences of religious fanaticism, showing how prejudice and zealotry could lead to terrible injustices. As you breathe slowly and let yourself relax more deeply, imagine Voltaire writing his Treatise on Tolerance, published after the Collars case, arguing that religious persecution served no useful purpose, that it contradicted the true spirit of Christianity, and that societies flourished best when people of different faiths could live together peacefully. He pointed to examples from various times and places where religious tolerance had been practiced successfully, and he argued that intolerance bred violence and suffering without achieving any genuine religious goals. Voltaire's arguments for tolerance were based partly on philosophical principles about human rights and the limits of governmental authority. He maintained that religious belief was a matter of conscience that could not be compelled by force, that people had a natural right to follow their own judgment in spiritual matters, and that the state had no legitimate interest in enforcing religious uniformity. But his arguments were also pragmatic, pointing out that persecution created martyrs, that it drove religious minorities to rebellion or emigration, and that religiously tolerant societies were generally more peaceful and prosperous than intolerant ones. Other Enlightenment thinkers went beyond Voltaire's relatively moderate position to question religious belief more fundamentally. Denis Diderot, while publicly maintaining a conventional religious stance to avoid prosecution, privately expressed materialist and atheist views in works that circulated in manuscript form. He questioned the coherence of religious doctrines, argued that morality did not require religious foundation, and suggested that the universe could be explained without reference to divine purpose or design. The Baron d'Holbach, a wealthy German-born nobleman who hosted an important salon in Paris, was even more radical in his religious skepticism. His work The System of Nature, published anonymously in 1770, argued for materialism and determinism, rejecting all forms of theism and supernatural belief. D'Holbach's atheism shocked even many other Enlightenment thinkers, who worried that such extreme views would discredit the broader Enlightenment project and would provide ammunition for critics who accused philosophers of undermining morality and social order. The question of how to organize society without the unifying force of shared religious belief was one that Enlightenment thinkers struggled with. Traditional political philosophy had assumed that religious uniformity was necessary for social cohesion, that shared faith provided the moral foundation on which political authority rested. If religion was to be privatized, if individuals were to be free to believe or not believe as they chose, what would hold society together? What would provide the shared values and commitments that made cooperation possible? As you rest quietly in the peaceful darkness, breathing slowly and deeply, you can appreciate how Enlightenment thinkers proposed various answers to this question. Some argued that rational ethics, based on enlightened self-interest and on recognition of universal human needs, could provide sufficient moral foundation without religious doctrine. Others suggested that public education could instill civic virtue and shared values. Still others maintained that some form of public religion or civil religion was necessary, though it should be tolerant and non-coercive rather than enforcing particular doctrines. The Enlightenment's challenge to religious authority extended beyond questions of tolerance and belief to include criticism of the Church's institutional power and wealth. Philosophers argued that the Church's vast landholdings should be taxed or confiscated and used for public purposes, that clerical privileges including exemption from taxation should be eliminated, that the state should control education rather than leaving it to the Church. These arguments anticipated reforms that would be implemented during the French Revolution, when church lands were seized and sold, when clergy were required to swear loyalty to the state, and when civil authority over marriage and other life events was established. The relationship between Enlightenment thought and religion was more complex than simple opposition. Many philosophers remained believers in some form, even when they criticized particular doctrines or practices. Some clergy were themselves sympathetic to Enlightenment ideas and worked to reconcile Catholic teaching with modern philosophy and science. Religious reform movements within the Church, including Jansenism and other tendencies that emphasized personal piety and moral rigor while questioning hierarchical authority, shared some concerns with Enlightenment critics. But the overall effect of Enlightenment religious thought was to undermine the authority of the Catholic Church and to create intellectual space for alternative views on fundamental questions about the universe, morality, and the good society. The Church's claim to possess revealed truth that must be accepted on faith was challenged by philosophers who insisted that truth must be discovered through reason and evidence. The Church's insistence on religious uniformity was opposed by arguments for tolerance and freedom of conscience. The Church's institutional power and wealth were criticized as obstacles to justice and progress. These challenges would contribute to the anti-clerical sentiment that would characterize revolutionary and post-revolutionary France and that would shape French political culture for generations. The Enlightenment spirit of rational inquiry and critique extended beyond politics and religion to include examination of economic questions, leading to the development of new theories about how wealth was created and how economic life should be organized. As you breathe slowly and rest comfortably, let me tell you about Enlightenment economic thought, particularly the school known as the physiocrats, and about how economic ideas contributed to challenges to the old regime. The economy of 18th century France was regulated in countless ways by royal and local authorities who controlled trade, manufacturing, and agriculture through a complex system of regulations, monopolies, guilds, and restrictions. This system, often called mercantilism or Colbertism after Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who had organized French economic policy under Louis XIV, aimed to increase royal revenues, to maintain employment, to protect domestic industries from foreign competition, and to ensure adequate food supplies. But critics argued that the system was inefficient, that it stifled economic initiative, that it served the interests of privileged groups rather than promoting general prosperity. The physiocrats, a group of economic thinkers who developed their ideas in the middle decades of the 18th century, proposed radical reforms based on a new understanding of how economies functioned. The term physiocracies meant the rule of nature, and the physiocrats believed that economic life was governed by natural laws that could be discovered through reason and observation, just as natural philosophers had discovered laws governing the physical universe. Understanding these natural economic laws and organizing society in accordance with them, rather than according to arbitrary regulations and interventions, would promote prosperity and welfare. The leading figure among the physiocrats was François Quesnay, a physician to Louis XV who applied medical concepts of circulation and balance to economic analysis. As you breathe slowly and let yourself relax more deeply, imagine Quesnay developing his tableau économique, an economic model showing how wealth circulated through different sectors of the economy, flowing from agriculture through manufacturing and commerce and back to agriculture in a continuous cycle. This model, published in 1758, was one of the first attempts to analyze the economy as an interconnected system rather than as a collection of separate activities. The physiocrats believed that agriculture was the only truly productive sector of the economy, the only activity that generated genuine surplus wealth rather than merely transforming existing wealth from one form to another. They argued that farmers and landowners were the productive class, that merchants and manufacturers were the sterile class who moved goods around but did not create new wealth, and that the nobility and clergy who lived on taxes and tithes were an unproductive burden on the productive classes. This analysis led them to advocate for policies that would favor agriculture, including eliminating restrictions on grain trade, reducing taxes on farmers, and consolidating land holdings to permit more efficient cultivation. The physiocratic prescription for economic policy was summarized in their famous phrase laissez-faire, laissez-passer, let do, let pass, meaning that government should allow individuals to pursue their own economic interests without interference and should allow goods to move freely without barriers or restrictions. They believed that natural economic laws, particularly the law of supply and demand, would coordinate individual economic activities in ways that promoted the common good more effectively than any system of regulation could. This was a radical challenge to the elaborate regulatory system that characterized the French economy. The physiocrats' influence on actual policy was limited, though some of their ideas were implemented in piecemeal fashion. In 1764, Controller General Béthune, sympathetic to physiocratic ideas, issued an edict allowing free trade in grain within France, removing restrictions that had prevented farmers from selling grain wherever they could get the best price. But this reform was controversial and was partially reversed after poor harvests led to food shortages and riots. The difficulty of implementing free trade in grain illustrated the tensions between economic theory and political reality, between long-term efficiency and short-term social stability. Beyond the physiocrats, other Enlightenment thinkers contributed to economic debate. And Robert Jacques Turgot, a philosophe and royal official who briefly served as Controller General under Louis XVI, combined physiocratic ideas with broader reformist ambitions. He attempted to implement reforms including abolishing guilds, eliminating forced labor obligations, and establishing free trade in grain. These reforms encountered fierce resistance from vested interests who benefited from the existing system, and Turgot was dismissed from office in 1776 after less than 2 years, his reforms largely reversed. As you rest quietly in the peaceful darkness, breathing slowly and deeply, you can understand how economic ideas contributed to a broader Enlightenment critique of the old regime. The physiocrats and other economic thinkers argued that the French economy was held back by outdated regulations and privileges, that wealth and prosperity could be increased by freeing economic activity from governmental and corporate restrictions, that the tax system was unjust and inefficient, placing heavy burdens on those least able to pay while exempting the privileged estates from their fair share. The economic critique intersected with political and social criticism to create a comprehensive challenge to the old regime's organization. If agriculture was being harmed by restrictions and unfair taxation, if commerce was being strangled by guilds and monopolies, if the tax system was arbitrary and regressive, then reform was needed not just in isolated areas but across the board. The economy, politics, and society were interconnected, and improving one area required addressing problems in all of them. The Enlightenment's economic thought also reflected broader values including rationalism, empiricism, and a faith in progress. Economic thinkers believed that studying how economies actually functioned, gathering data about production and trade, testing theories against evidence, could lead to genuine knowledge that would benefit society. They believed that economic relations were governed by natural laws that human reason could discover, just as Newton had discovered laws of physics. And they believed that applying this knowledge to policy could improve human welfare, reducing poverty, increasing prosperity, making life better for ordinary people. Not all Enlightenment economic thought pointed toward free markets and minimal government. Rousseau, for instance, was skeptical of commerce and worried that economic inequality and luxury corrupted morals and undermined civic virtue. He argued for simpler economies with less pronounced inequality, even at the cost of reduced wealth and sophistication. These tensions within Enlightenment thought reflected different values and different visions of the good society, but they shared a commitment to rational examination of economic questions and a rejection of the assumption that existing arrangements should simply be accepted because they were traditional. By the final decades of the 18th century, the French monarchy found itself facing multiple crises that called into question its ability to govern effectively, and that created opportunities for Enlightenment ideas to move from philosophical speculation to practical politics. As you breathe slowly and rest comfortably, let me tell you about how the intellectual currents we have been exploring began to intersect with political and fiscal realities to create a situation in which fundamental change became possible. The reign of Louis XVI, who became king in 1774 at the age of 19, coincided with mounting problems that the monarchy struggled to address. The most pressing issue was fiscal crisis. The French government's expenditures consistently exceeded its revenues, leading to growing debt that consumed an increasing portion of the budget in interest payments. Various attempts at financial reform had failed to solve the problem, partly because of the tax system's fundamental inadequacies and partly because of resistance from privileged groups who blocked reforms that threatened their interests. The French tax system was notoriously inequitable and inefficient. The taille, the main direct tax, fell primarily on peasants and commoners, while the nobility and clergy were largely exempt. Indirect taxes on salt, wine, and other goods were collected by tax farmers, private contractors who paid the government a fixed amount for the right to collect taxes and who then kept whatever they could extract beyond that amount, creating incentives for aggressive collection and for corruption. The system generated insufficient revenue while creating widespread resentment among those who bore the heaviest burdens. As you breathe slowly and let yourself relax more deeply, imagine the frustration of royal ministers trying to reform this system and running into obstacles at every turn. Turgot's attempted reforms in the 1770s founded on resistance from privileged groups and from the parlements, the regional courts that claimed the right to review royal edicts and that often represented privileged interests. Jacques Necker, a Swiss banker who served as finance minister at several points, tried to manage the fiscal crisis through loans and administrative reforms, but he too struggled against entrenched interests and political opposition. The fiscal crisis was exacerbated by France's involvement in the American Revolutionary War from 1778 to 1783. French support for American independence was motivated partly by desire to weaken Britain, France's traditional rival, but it was expensive, requiring military and naval deployments that strained the treasury. The irony of a monarchy based on absolute power supporting a revolution against monarchical authority in the name of liberty was not lost on observers, and the example of successful revolution in America would influence French reformers and revolutionaries in the years that followed. By the mid-1780s, the fiscal crisis had become acute. The government was having difficulty borrowing money as creditors lost confidence in its ability to repay. The Comptroller General, Charles Alexandre de Calonne, concluded that fundamental tax reform was necessary, requiring not just administrative changes but changes that would affect the privileges of nobility and clergy. He proposed a comprehensive reform package including a universal land tax that would apply to all estates without exception, elimination of internal customs barriers, and other measures designed to rationalize the tax system and increase revenues. Calonne recognized that these reforms could not be implemented by royal decree alone, given the certain opposition they would face from privileged groups and from the parliaments. He convinced Louis XVI to summon an assembly of notables in 1787, a gathering of prominent nobles, clergy, and officials who might approve the reform package and lend it legitimacy. But the notables refused to approve comprehensive reform, defending their privileges and calling for convening the Estates General, the representative assembly that had not met since 1614. The calling of the Estates General for May 1789 would prove to be a turning point in French history, though neither Louis XVI nor his ministers fully grasped how revolutionary the consequences would be. The process of electing deputies and of drafting cahiers de doléances, lists of grievances and demands from each electoral district, created opportunities for public discussion of political and social questions that had been largely confined to intellectual circles. The grievances expressed in these cahiers showed how widely Enlightenment ideas had spread, with demands for legal equality, for freedom of the press, for regular meetings of the Estates General, for protection of individual rights. As you rest quietly in the peaceful darkness, breathing slowly and deeply, you can sense how the meeting of the Estates General in May 1789 brought together multiple tensions that had been building for decades. There were fiscal tensions arising from the monarchy's financial crisis. There were social tensions arising from resentment of privilege and from the gap between the legal status of different estates and their actual economic and cultural importance. There were political tensions arising from disputes about how the Estates General should function and about whether it represented the nation or merely transmitted the views of the separate estates to the king. And underneath all of these specific tensions lay the intellectual challenge that Enlightenment thought had posed to the fundamental principles of absolute monarchy. The transformation of the Estates General into the National Assembly in June 1789 marked the moment when ideas that had been circulating in books and salons began to be translated into political practice. When the Third Estate declared itself the National Assembly and claimed to represent the French nation rather than merely one estate, when it swore the tennis court oath pledging not to disperse until France had a constitution, it was asserting principles of popular sovereignty and limited government that Enlightenment thinkers had developed over previous decades. The language of natural rights, of the social contract, of the general will, moved from philosophical speculation to political declaration. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, adopted by the National Assembly in August 1789, embodied Enlightenment principles in constitutional form. It proclaimed that men are born free and equal in rights, that the purpose of political association is to preserve natural rights including liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression, that sovereignty resides in the nation, that law should be the expression of the general will, that citizens have rights to freedom of speech and press. These principles challenged the fundamental assumptions of absolute monarchy and of the hierarchical social order that had characterized the old regime. The relationship between Enlightenment ideas and the Revolution was complex and contested. Revolutionary leaders invoked Enlightenment philosophers to legitimize their actions, but they often interpreted and applied Enlightenment ideas in ways that the philosophers themselves might not have endorsed or anticipated. Montesquieu had advocated for separation of powers and for checks on royal authority, but he had not imagined the kind of democratic revolution that occurred in France. Voltaire had called for enlightened despotism and religious tolerance, but he had not advocated democracy or radical social transformation. Rousseau's ideas about popular sovereignty and the general will were invoked by revolutionaries, but whether Rousseau himself would have approved of how these concepts were applied remains uncertain. What is clear is that the Enlightenment had fundamentally altered the intellectual landscape of France, creating a climate in which the old regime's principles and practices could be questioned, in which alternative forms of social and political organization could be imagined, in which ordinary people could claim rights and dignities that had been denied under absolute monarchy. The revolution did not simply implement an Enlightenment program, as no such unified program existed, but it drew on Enlightenment ideas and arguments to justify and explain the transformation it was bringing about. As we approach the conclusion of this story about ideas and their quiet power to reshape societies, as you rest peacefully breathing slowly and deeply, let me reflect with you on how Enlightenment thought gradually undermined the intellectual foundations of absolute monarchy in France and prepared the ground for the transformations that would follow. The French Enlightenment was not an organized movement with a clear program and unified goals, but rather a broad intellectual tendency characterized by critical examination of traditional authorities and institutions, by faith in human reason as a tool for understanding and improving the world, and by commitment to values including individual liberty, legal equality, religious tolerance, and popular sovereignty. Different Enlightenment thinkers emphasized different aspects of this broad tendency and proposed different reforms, sometimes disagreeing sharply with each other about specific questions. But together they created a powerful critique of the old regime and a vision of alternative possibilities. The process by which Enlightenment ideas spread through French society was gradual and subtle, operating through multiple channels including published books and pamphlets, manuscript circulation of controversial works, discussions in salons and cafes, correspondence networks linking intellectuals across France and Europe, and eventually through the cahiers de doléances prepared for the Estates General. This process was not a simple transmission of ideas from philosophers to masses, but rather involved complex interactions in which ideas were adapted, simplified, combined with other concerns, and applied to specific situations in ways that the original thinkers might not have anticipated. As you breathe slowly and let yourself sink deeper into peaceful rest, you can appreciate how ideas work in history, how they interact with material conditions and political circumstances to shape events. Ideas alone do not cause revolutions, but they provide language and justification for actions that might otherwise seem unthinkable. They help people articulate grievances and imagine alternatives. They create intellectual frameworks that make certain kinds of political and social arrangements seem natural or legitimate while making others seem arbitrary or unjust. The Enlightenment's challenge to absolute monarchy operated on several levels. At the most fundamental level, it challenged the theory of divine right by asserting that political authority had to be justified by its service to human welfare rather than by religious or traditional claims. Montesquieu, Rousseau, and other political thinkers developed secular theories of political legitimacy based on consent, on protection of rights, on promotion of the common good. These theories implied that monarchs who ruled badly, who violated rights, who served private interests rather than the public good, were illegitimate and could rightfully be resisted or removed. At a second level, Enlightenment thought challenged specific features of the old regime, including religious intolerance, censorship, arbitrary justice, tax privileges for nobility and clergy, and the absence of legal protections for individual rights. The reforms that Enlightenment thinkers advocated, from religious tolerance to freedom of press to legal equality to rational taxation, would require fundamental changes in how France was governed and organized, changes incompatible with maintaining absolute monarchy in its traditional form. At a third level, the Enlightenment created alternative sources of intellectual and cultural authority that competed with the monarchy and the church. The Republic of Letters, the community of intellectuals connected through publication and correspondence, functioned as a kind of alternative public sphere where ideas could be debated and where opinions could be formed independently of official pronouncements. Salon culture created social spaces where merit and intelligence counted alongside birth and wealth. The encyclopedia and similar projects attempted to organize and present human knowledge in ways that implicitly challenged traditional hierarchies of learning and authority. The impact of Enlightenment ideas on different social groups varied considerably. Educated elites, including many members of the nobility and higher clergy, read Enlightenment works and participated in salon culture, often finding ways to reconcile new ideas with their privileged positions. The growing bourgeoisie, educated professionals, and substantial merchants who were economically important but legally inferior to nobility, found in Enlightenment thought justification for their aspirations to greater political influence and social recognition. Urban artisans and workers might encounter simplified versions of Enlightenment ideas through popular pamphlets or through political clubs and might find in concepts like natural rights and popular sovereignty language for expressing their grievances. Peasants, the vast majority of the population were less directly influenced by Enlightenment thought but were affected by its indirect consequences as elites who had absorbed Enlightenment ideas advocated for reforms. As you rest quietly in the peaceful darkness, breathing slowly and deeply, completely relaxed, you can understand that by 1789, when the Estates General convened, the intellectual transformation that the Enlightenment had worked was substantial though incomplete. Absolute monarchy still stood, Louis XVI still ruled from Versailles, the social hierarchy of three estates still existed in law. But the intellectual foundations of this system had been eroded. Educated people increasingly thought about political authority in terms of popular sovereignty rather than divine right, about social organization in terms of rights and equality rather than hierarchy and privilege, about progress through reason rather than deference to tradition. The monarchy's response to Enlightenment thought had been inconsistent and ultimately ineffective. Some monarchs and ministers had tried to harness Enlightenment ideas for their own purposes, attempting to implement reforms from above while maintaining royal authority. This strategy of enlightened despotism had some successes in other European countries but never worked effectively in France, partly because of resistance from privileged groups and partly because the logic of Enlightenment thought ultimately pointed toward limitations on royal power that absolute monarchs were unwilling to accept. Censorship had slowed but not stopped the spread of Enlightenment ideas, and attempts at repression sometimes backfired by making forbidden books more attractive and by creating martyrs whose persecution demonstrated the oppressive nature of the system. The monarchy's financial crisis and its inability to implement necessary reforms demonstrated the practical inadequacy of absolute monarchy, reinforcing intellectual critiques with evidence of governmental failure. The story of the Enlightenment in France is not primarily a story of revolution but of intellectual transformation, of how ideas slowly changed how people thought about themselves and their society, of how critical reason applied to political and social questions gradually undermined the legitimacy of institutions that had seemed permanent and unquestionable. The revolution would begin in 1789 and would unfold in dramatic and often violent ways that neither Enlightenment thinkers nor anyone else had fully anticipated. But the revolution was made possible by the intellectual groundwork that the Enlightenment had laid, by the decades of questioning and criticism that had prepared people to imagine and to create new forms of political and social organization. Sleep peacefully now, dear friend, knowing that ideas matter, that thought and argument can slowly reshape the world, that the work of philosophers writing in their studies and of people discussing in salons can contribute to transformations as fundamental as any brought about by armies or economic forces. The Enlightenment showed that human reason applied patiently and courageously to questions of how we should live together can challenge even the most entrenched authorities and can create possibilities for freedom and justice that did not exist before. Rest now in the knowledge that the quiet revolution of thought in 18th century France prepared the way for political revolutions that would transform Europe and that would inspire people seeking liberty and equality across the world for generations to come. The monarchy still stands as we end our story tonight. The king still rules from Versailles. The old regime persists in form, but its foundations have shifted. Ideas have done their work quietly but surely. What comes next will be dramatic and consequential, but tonight we rest with the understanding that fundamental change often begins not with upheaval but with thought, not with violence but with ideas spreading quietly through conversation and publication, reshaping how people see the world and understand their place in it. Sleep well.